Okay, so we're going to get into our first talk now. The first talk is going to be by Dr. Theresa Jean Tanenbaum, also goes by Tess, as a researcher, scholar, teacher, designer, artist, tinker, maker, and activist who uses digital storytelling and games to help people transform their perspective on the world and their place in it to bring about positive change. She's the founder of the Name Change Policy Working Group and has worked with COPE, the ACM, Sage, Springer, Taylor and Francis, and Elsevier, and many other publishers to develop identity practices in publishing that safeguard the privacy of transgender authors seeking to update their scholarly records to reflect their correct names. So without further ado, I'm going to promote our wonderful speaker to a panelist, and she'll take it away.
Hi. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and then we're going to get started. There we go. All right, can everybody see this? Great, so hi, yes, I'm Tess, I'm Theresa Jean Tanenbaum. I'm really excited to be here. I think this is the third Queer in AI workshop that I have participated in, but it's the first one that I've had a chance to actually present my work and my background in detail at, and so I'm really looking forward to sharing this. I'm going to be talking about the work I've done advocating for trans-inclusive name change policies and practices in academic publishing. I'm a queer transgender woman. I'm neurodivergent. I have a chronic health condition. I am a witch. I super stan Cora, and I'm actually thinking about doing Cora cosplay this Halloween. So I feel like I am in good company in this room. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about this today. I think so. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Informatics at UC Irvine. My work is interdisciplinary. I run a group that creates and evaluates experiences of what we call transformative play. And I am, by training and practice, a storyteller. I use a combination of computational narrative techniques and theatrical production elements to create participatory narrative experiences. And these often combine digital and physical elements and usually involve role play or performance or other forms of structured enactment. My systems are a form of XR, or extended reality, meaning that they might be variously classified as virtual reality, augmented reality, or mixed reality, depending on the project in question. I also have a background in theater and music, and so I draw on techniques from method actor training and the performing arts to inform my work. For example, in this video, you can see participants interacting with our Magia Transformo experience at Indiecade in 2017. They are dressed as witches with RFID augmented costumes, holding digital interactive spellbooks, and gathered around a cauldron that belches smoke and colored light. As with most of the experiences I design, Magia Transformo is embodied, visceral, active, tangible, and theatrical. And like most of my work, it uses costume design and wearable technology to produce a literal experience of being transformed into a character. And while my work is quite playful on the surface, it is also engaged at some level with more serious questions of identity. Who do we get to be in the world? What identities are permitted or denied to us? How does it feel to take on another role or perspective? And how do we design to facilitate perspective taking? It is from this perspective that my interest in identity infrastructures and name change policies begins to fit into the bigger picture of my research. Ultimately, I seek to use these participatory narrative systems to create opportunities for people who have been systematically oppressed or marginalized to reclaim agency that has been denied to them. By empowering people to inhabit stories and identities where they can reclaim control over the structures that have oppressed them, I believe it is possible to produce futures that are more just and equitable. And unfortunately, I won't be going into that side of my research in detail tonight, but this other work very much connects to it because I view equity and justice as design poetics for the work that I do. And while this has been implicit within a lot of my earlier work, it has only been in the last 2 years that this has become a central and explicit focus of my scholarship and my service. This is because issues of equity, especially as they pertain to questions of identity, have taken on a personal urgency in my life since coming out as a transgender woman in 2019 and changing my name. This has led me to devote a significant amount of my life over the past 2 years to advocating for trans-inclusive name change policies within scholarly publishing. Now, there are two big hurdles that I've faced when seeking to correct my name in my previous work. First, not all publishers recognize the necessity and importance of making these changes in an accessible, comprehensive, private, timely, and sustainable way. Publishers are not prepared to make these changes from a practical standpoint. In the 2 years that I've been working on this problem, I've been fortunate enough to make significant progress on clearing this first hurdle. The second hurdle remains a significant challenge. So in this talk, I'll be reflecting on the personal circumstances that led to me taking on this work. I'll discuss the work that I've been doing with authors and publishers and other stakeholders. I'm just going to pull up the chat screen so I can monitor that while we talk. And I'm going to go into a considerable amount of nuts and bolts detail about how I've been doing this work, because I think it's important to model successful practices of advocating for institutional change around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. To close, I'll consider some of the implications for the future of how we think about our digital identities. Actually, let me press my slides. Choosing a new name as a trans person is both profoundly affirming and also extremely intimidating. There's so much to consider. Should it be easy to pronounce? Should it be easy to spell, easy to remember? Did I want a short name or a long one? Should it mean something special? I considered all of these things and more. I thought about search engine optimization. I thought about ease of writing and ease of signing. Picking your own name is fraught. What would my name say about me? In the same way that my wife and I deliberated over our daughter's name for the months leading up to her birth, I found myself carrying around lists of names that I was auditioning. Was I a Josie or a Hannah? Do I take a family name? Do I take a name that is similar to my old masculine one so that I can make my transition more comfortable for the people around me? I was hoping I wouldn't have to make this decision on my own, and so I asked my mother what she would have called me if she'd known that I was a girl when I was born. Unfortunately, if she'd picked out any girl names for me, she hadn't remembered any of them. It was clear that she wasn't going to be any help with this, and I was going to have to do it myself. And this is a kind of privilege granted to very few of us, and one of the many aspects of the trans experience that I find empowering and beautiful. And I really didn't want to screw it up. I was going to have to live with this choice. And my process of coming out was haphazard. But the tipping point in my professional community was at the ACM Designing Interactive Systems Conference in June of 2019. At that point, I'd been slowly adopting a more gender non-conforming and non-binary style and presentation, but hadn't really explained to anybody what was going on, aside from a very small group of people that I trusted on Facebook. At DIS, I took a leap that I'd been anxious about for months. I left all of my masculine attire at home and attended the conference en femme, except for my beard and my, at that point, unchanged name. I also took what felt like an enormous leap, and I asked for new pronouns. She, her, or they, them, prominently called out on stickers on my conference badge. I had never dared request she, her pronouns before, and while I desperately wanted people to see and acknowledge this about me, I also felt like I was imposing on the people around me, that I was asking them all to humor me. But this is how I found myself in a dress in the hotel lobby chatting with my friend and colleague Elizabeth Churchill, who was at that point the vice president of the ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery. And she said, the ACM is trying to figure out how to handle author name changes, but we've been stuck for the last year. Is that something you'd be interested in? And I allowed that I had been thinking about this, but that I didn't yet know if or when I'd change my name. And she asked if I'd like to be added to the conversation. And I agreed. My experience being out at DIS showed me that I could be out and trans in my professional world and not be a pariah. And so even though I still felt a lot of imposter syndrome, even though I didn't feel like I had the right to call myself trans, let alone a woman, I threw caution to the wind and I came out on July 4th, 2019. By this time, I had the first piece of my name, Tess. I thought the rest of it might be tesseract or tessellate. I wasn't certain. Maybe testrogen. Theresa Jean Tanenbaum would come later. Being called by my new name and pronouns was one of the most profound joys of my early transition. Tess Tannenbaum felt like a superhero's secret identity to me, or like the hero from a pulp detective story or a noir thriller. It was also a reference to my daughter's middle name, Tesla, which my wife and I had picked specifically because we thought that Tess Tannenbaum was such a cool nickname. But after living for decades with a name that had made me feel wrong and invisible, having a name that felt like me was intoxicating. And so it wasn't long before my relationship with my old name became somewhat fraught. The term that many trans people use to describe their previous name is dead name. I prefer necronym, but I'm going to stick with dead name for this talk. And the longer I was out, the more accurate that word started to feel to me. Where I had been relatively sanguine about my dead name at first, it soon became a source of real trauma and pain for me. And as a relatively successful junior scholar, my dead name was everywhere in my professional life, a ghost of my former self that was rattling my chains and demanding to be given peace so it could finally rest. I knew that I'd be going up for tenure in a year, and this was a significant concern for me. The idea of my dead name being broadcast across my tenure materials made me physically ill. I didn't want the tenure committee to be focused on my transness such that they were unable to properly consider my professional accomplishments. I also didn't want my bibliometrics to be impacted by the fact that I'd changed my name, so much so that I actually briefly considered taking a new name that shared initials with my previous first and middle names in hopes that I'd be able to ease the process of retaining credit for my previous publications. And ultimately, I discarded this idea. The idea of being dead named throughout my tenure case made me so uncomfortable that I set out to change my name on as many of my previously published works as possible. At the time, I very naively thought that publishers had pre-existing pathways for people to change their names. After all, many people, most often women, changed their names at marriage or divorce, and we'll talk about that a little later in the talk. What I found surprised me. Not a single one of the 15 venues where my work was published had any formal policy or process for changing the name on a paper after publication. In fact, in 2019, when I started this work, there wasn't a single major publisher who explicitly permitted authors to change their names on previously published works. New name in hand, I reached out to the ACM people about the working group that Elizabeth had invited me to and asked them to start correcting my name on my publications. Within a week, I'd been added to a Basecamp project where the group had been deliberating for the last year. I was joined by 3 trans and non-binary friends and colleagues, Kata Spiel, Robin Spear, and Z Toops. We discovered that the lone trans person in the group before us, a graduate student who had started the ball rolling with the ACM over a year previously, had reached a point where they felt unheard and frustrated by the rest of the group and needed to take a step back. They were burned out. And so the 4 of us were the only trans voices in the conversation. The rest of the group was comprised of the ACM publication staff who oversaw the day-to-day operations of the digital library, and several members of the ACM Publications Board who oversaw matters of publication policy for the association. In 2019, it was unprecedented for 4 relatively junior transgender scholars to find themselves with a seat at the table, helping to shape a policy that would impact a platform as large as the ACM Digital Library, especially a policy with no precedent within the publishing world. The ACM, to their very great credit, had acknowledged that it might just be possible to change the names of trans people on previous publications. However, it was clear to us at the beginning that the people making decisions about the policy understood nothing about the needs of trans people. The proposed measures under discussion upon our arrival were actually doing more harm than good. They were unwilling to correct the PDF versions of published works, and they wanted to limit name changes to only the subset of transgender authors who could show that they'd legally changed their names. As proposed, the ACM's new policy would juxtapose the dead name and correct name of any authors who changed their name in a way that violated their privacy and safety, exposing them to bias and discrimination. It would also gatekeep the policy to only authors who were fortunate enough to live in regions that allowed legal name changes, a time-consuming and costly process under the best of circumstances. To give you a sense of what it looks like when a publisher discloses a trans person's dead name in a way that highlights their gender identity, here is an example from my life. When I reached out to Springer to update my name, only 2 of the journal editors I contacted offered me any solution. The solution they offered was to issue a correction to my article. And at the time, I accepted this, despite my misgivings about how it would be handled. And the resulting published correction visibly juxtaposed my dead name and correct name in a way that made my transness apparent to even a casual reader. Even as I was discovering how challenging it would be to create an inclusive policy at the ACM, I was also facing similar situations at many of the other publishers where I was seeking to change my name. The central problem was that even editors and publishers who were sympathetic to my requests saw correcting the record as humoring an author at best and violating the historical record at worst. And there's some quotes from things people said to us over the course of this process. And this adherence to the notion of some sort of sacrosanct historical record fails to understand the myriad of ways in which this record is a construct constituted by our ongoing collective negotiations around what is and isn't a meaningful contribution to the project of scholarship. The historical record of necessity is a curated archive. As a community, we agree that certain information merits preservation and other information doesn't. Scholars of archives recognize that the task of maintaining the information we've chosen to preserve is a dynamic and ongoing one, involving continuous transformation across different platforms and standards. The so-called historical record is a living thing that we all collectively tend to and nurture to advance the project of knowledge production and preservation. Insisting on the sanctity of some sort of static, idealized historical record misunderstands the very nature of such a record, and it misses the ways in which that record enshrines power relationships, protecting some people and marginalizing others. Many publishers pointed to a 2013 ruling from the Committee of Publication Ethics, or COPE. COPE is a nonprofit organization that issues ethical guidance to thousands of publishers, associations, and journals worldwide, and helps to mediate disputes between publishers and authors. The ruling in question was a case where an author had sought a name change on a previous work because the name they'd published under was one that revealed their caste status, although a misspelling of the word caste in the initial request might have made that unclear to the COPE forum members. Implied within this request was that the author was experiencing discomfort or fear discrimination as a result of disclosing their caste in this prior publication. In the discussion, the forum argued that the name was correct when the paper was published and suggested that the problem was a matter of vanity, unless the author could provide a more valid reason for the change. The ruling stated that it wasn't ethically problematic for publishers to grant a name change, but that publishers shouldn't feel ethically bound to honor this request. The COPE forum voted that the author had not provided a sufficiently convincing or valid reason to change their name, and the case was closed. I was told by multiple major publishers that this COPE ruling was the basis for their refusal to grant my name change requests. It's worth noting that at this point in 2019, I knew virtually nothing about the publishing world beyond what I had learned in my own experiences as an author. I honestly knew very little about other transgender people's experiences outside of my own and those of a few close trans friends. And so I spent much of 2019 learning everything I could about the perspectives of publishers, the legal constraints they were working with, and the needs of trans people, especially trans people of color and trans people outside of North America and Europe who might want to change their names. Over the course of many long negotiations with the publishers of my work and long conversations with other trans people, I honed my knowledge and my arguments in favor of name change policies. The first and most critical piece of this argument was to properly frame the problem. Denying transgender authors the ability to change our names within their publication record is a form of discrimination that produces ongoing active harm. I set out to enumerate these harms in ways that I hoped the publishers I was negotiating with would appreciate and understand. And I'll unpack each of these in some detail, but at the high level, these are the harms that the publishing world was causing by refusing to correct previous publications. Violation of privacy. Trans people are subjected to increased harassment, discrimination, and violence. Denial of credit. Leaving names unchanged means that the scholarship of trans authors is no longer correctly attributed to them and exposes them to greater precarity in the academic review process. Denial of dignity. Dead naming is an act of violence. It dehumanizes trans people and denies them the validity of their identity. And ongoing corrective epistemic labor. Uncorrected papers incur ongoing corrective labor for publishers and authors. And the headlines I have here are drawn from just what was in the news last week when I was making this talk. So I didn't search more than 5 days back, and it was depressingly easy to find headlines like this. Publishing an author's dead name exposes them to discrimination, harassment, and violence. As a transgender woman, I am subjected to daily reminders that there are thousands of people in the world who don't want me to exist, at least not as myself. These people don't always go so far as to state out loud that they want to kill me, although many of them will send me private messages indicating that they do. But they are very proud to campaign to eliminate my right to health care, employment protection, protection from housing discrimination, and my right to exist and participate in public spaces. They want to erase me and people like me from the public sphere, to silence us and hope that we'll just go away. And unfortunately, the distressingly high suicide rate among trans people is a testament to the power of the anti-trans lobby's well-funded campaign of public disgust and hatred. For this reason, it's of critical importance that transgender people be able to exercise as much control as possible over the disclosure of our gender identity. When a publisher discloses an author's dead name in a context where it is easily juxtaposed against our correct names, it is no different than if they had announced our sexuality, our marital status, or even our religious affiliation. And as is often the case, this doesn't just announce the gender identity of the author. It also announces their location and contact information, as many publications include affiliations and mailing addresses for authors. These concerns are not abstract. One of my close friends and colleagues, a non-binary trans woman, had a gun fired through the window of her house after her gender identity became the subject of discussion among her neighbors. And as frightening as this is, it is still quite benign when compared to what transgender academics face around the world. Not only are transgender people subjected to a greater threat of harassment and discrimination, but in many places, it is law enforcement officials who are often the main perpetrators of this abuse and violence. Second harm was denial of credit. Publishers endanger the career and safety of a trans author by forcing them to disclose their dead name and gender identity in order to receive credit for their work. Disclosing someone's transition through the use of their previous name not only endangers that person's life and livelihood, but also exposes them to implicit and explicit bias in terms of citations, tenure and promotion, and other aspects of their professional life. A trans scholar should be evaluated based on their scholarship, not their gender identity. Allowing an incorrect name to persist within the scholarly record also incurs ongoing costs to a trans author by splitting their bibliometrics across 2 different online identities. This complicates citation counts, makes H-index and I-10 scores more difficult to calculate, and leads other scholars to continue to miscite the trans person in future publications. Dead naming a trans person goes beyond simply making them uncomfortable. Last fall, I wrote about the experience that I have of being dead named and misgendered. When it happens, I have a physical reaction, a reaction that is beyond my control. My vision narrows, vignettes, and I can't perceive anything in my periphery. My skin becomes clammy, my heart pounds, my throat closes up, my ears ring. I can't talk or think or even cry at first. I need to get out, to hide, to find a safe place and remind myself that I'm free, that I'm not that person, was never really that person. I use the word trauma to describe the experience of being dead named or misgendered because it is a precise and accurate term to describe what happens to me when people slip. It is harmful to me, even if there is no harmful intent. These harms also intersect. The harms of this trauma response, coupled with the harms of inadvertent disclosure, can extend beyond the individual trans person. I've discussed how being dead named causes me to experience an involuntary trauma response. Consider now how it felt for me when an eager undergraduate student in one of my classes did some extra research for an assignment, located several uncorrected publications of mine online, cited them in a paper, and then shared this with the rest of the class on our message board. It's difficult to maintain your impartiality when reviewing student work that is actively re-traumatizing you. While I experienced the direct consequences of the student's discovery, they experienced the indirect consequences of traumatizing me, despite their having no ill intention towards me. I think of the propagation of my dead name like the spread of a virus. Leaving a paper uncorrected for far too long also creates more downstream labor for publishers and authors by increasing the number of transmission vectors for the damaging information. It's currently impossible to account for all of the digital copies of my scholarship that have been downloaded or entered into people's bibliographic management systems. That ship has unfortunately sailed. However, a timely correction can prevent new people from discovering and indexing a version of the paper with my dead name in it. This is important because one of the biggest transmission vectors for my dead name is in the bibliographies of other people's publications. As more publishers commit to removing dead names from their records, including inciting papers, the time and effort involved in correcting these records will only increase. Reducing the propagation of the dead name as early as possible can help reduce labor and expenses for everybody down the road. There are real pragmatic costs that arise from both refusing to correct an author's name and from gatekeeping access to name changes. The costs impact the author, their students, their colleagues, and the field at large. For the last 2 years, I have spent a full workday every week in the process of self-advocacy around my name change. This is 3.5 months, or almost 2 full academic quarters of time and labor invested in this process. Despite taking all of this time, there are still countless places where my dead name persists online. The time that I spend trying to correct my name on my scholarship is time when I'm not doing new research. It's time when I'm not preparing for my classes or grading papers or advising my graduate students. It's time when I'm not doing other forms of service to my university or the field. It's time that scholars who haven't changed their name don't have to spend. And it's important to frame these harms within the broader burdens shouldered by marginalized persons, especially when it comes to the labor that we do in order to safely exist in the world. In 2016, Nora Berenstein coined the term epistemic exploitation to describe this exact phenomenon. Drawing on experiences recounted by Black women, she writes, "Epistemic exploitation occurs when privileged persons compel marginalized persons to educate them about the nature of their oppression. I argue that epistemic exploitation is marked by unrecognized, uncompensated, emotionally taxing, coerced epistemic labor. The coercive and exploitative aspects of this phenomenon are exemplified by the unpaid nature of the educational labor and its associated opportunity costs, the double bind that marginalized persons must navigate when faced with the demand to educate, and the need for additional labor created by the default skepticism of the privileged." Berenstein cites Audre Lorde, who perfectly captures how this feels. Black and third world people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. Women are expected to educate men. Lesbians and gay men are expected to educate the heterosexual world. The oppressors maintain their position and evade their responsibility for their own actions. There is a constant drain of energy, which might be better used in redefining ourselves and devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future. Most historically excluded and oppressed people experience epistemic exploitation throughout their lives, sometimes without even realizing it. When I shifted from a position of relative privilege to a position of significant vulnerability, I found myself expending effort educating my cisgender colleagues about the nature of my experiences, just to be accorded some small measure of the safety, security, and privilege that they received by default. I was complaining about this to my colleague and collaborator, Kata Spiel, who was the one who pointed me towards Bernstein's paper, and reading it, it felt like being struck by lightning. By requiring oppressed people to shoulder the burden of educating the people around them about the nature of their oppression, epistemic exploitation perpetuates that oppression. It puts the burden and the responsibility for change on people who are already more vulnerable, while simultaneously reducing their available resources to effect change. And it allows more privileged people to maintain their own ignorance of their complicity in upholding systems of oppression. Engaging in this kind of labor is made more difficult by the fact that privileged people are often skeptical about the oppression that marginalized people experience. Bernstein writes, "The default skepticism of the privileged is itself an expression of privilege. People who do not face a specific type of oppression have the privilege of remaining ignorant about the ways that oppression exists and manifests. For example, non-disabled persons have the privilege of not knowing whether the buildings they work in are accessible. Cisgender people have the privilege of not knowing the locations of safe, gender-neutral bathrooms. White scholars have the privilege of not knowing that meritocracy has never been a feature of academia," etc. Working on the ACM name change policy was an extended exercise in epistemic labor in the face of a default skepticism that required us to make the same arguments repeatedly. However, in September 2019, after several months of deliberation, I managed to persuade the rest of the working group members to allow us to draft a new name change policy. Working around the clock for several days, the three of us hashed out the core of ACM's new policy. The policy document that we wrote was ultimately cut down substantially by the ACM publication staff, resulting in a compromised version of the policy that was officially approved by the publications board on November of 2019. And although it was imperfect, for instance, it required trans authors to seek the permission of the authors of papers that dead named them within their bibliographies before they could be corrected, it still represented a radical step towards trans inclusivity in the publishing world, the first trans-inclusive name change policy to be adopted by a major publisher. Since the approval of this policy, we have continued to advocate for the rest of the publishing world to adopt similar policies. The ACM policy was proof that it was possible to convince publishers that they needed to grant name changes. However, after the struggles that we had in producing it, I started to fear that this would be a 10 to 20 year long project, that this crusade would consume the rest of my career. Although most of my scholarship was in the ACM Digital Library, over a dozen of my publications were in journals published by Springer, and I'd been arguing with them since I came out. After months of making a nuisance of myself to dozens of editors, I eventually found myself in a conversation with Ed Gerstner, Springer's director of journal policy and strategy. Ed's position was that it would be hard to get buy-in from the editors and publishers who set these policies unless there was a shift in the consensus within the academic community. He offered me a platform in Nature, which I eagerly accepted. Published in July of 2020 and using my experiences with the ACM policy as a case study, this article started a conversation in the academic publishing world that put me in conversation with many more people than I'd previously encountered. The Nature article led several transgender academics in different fields to reach out to me, sharing their own struggles and their own successes at getting their names changed. On July 22nd, 2020, on the same day that the Nature article was published, I started a working group and created a Discord server for us to compare notes and help each other navigate the process of trying to persuade publishers in our fields to start adopting policies of their own. This group would eventually grow to include over 50 scholars from diverse fields and backgrounds. And it could grow to include you. I'm happy to welcome more people into the group if you're interested in the topic and want to join the conversation. We found ourselves confronted with a significant problem of epistemic exploitation. We kept encountering the same objections and concerns that we sought to have our names changed, and it was draining and counterproductive for each of us to individually refute these concerns. Now, as part of the approval process at the ACM, we had circulated the draft policy to the entire ACM membership for comments and feedback. The comments that we collected represented a comprehensive accounting of the kinds of objections and concerns that such policies elicit. I treated these as a source of data. I sorted them, categorized them, and identified common themes and areas of concern within them. These became the basis for our first major output as a group, an article that laid out the stakes for trans scholars when publishers don't change our names, and unpacked and debunked the common arguments that we'd collectively encountered while seeking to correct this. By pooling our knowledge in this way, we were able to reduce the amount of epistemic labor we were each doing individually, and we were able to greatly shorten many of the preliminary negotiations with publishers. My plan for starting a conversation in the academic publishing world was working. Members of my working group and I started to receive interview requests, and more publishers were starting to announce their own policies. Word was spreading in academic circles. In September of 2020, a colleague of Irving Reddig, one of our founding members, invited us to join a COPE working group to try and develop formal guidance for the publishing world. Our first action within this working group was to issue an update to the problematic 2013 case, which so many publishers were referring to as their justification for denying name change requests. We then set about discussing and preparing formal COPE recommendations for how to handle name changes. I realized that while a growing number of publishers were starting their own policy work, nobody had articulated the high-level principles for how these changes should be approached. And so with the blessing of the COPE working group, I drafted a document in collaboration with the NCPWG that collected the knowledge and experience we had accrued over the last year and outlined a vision for the future. The resulting article outlined 5 high-level principles for a more trans-inclusive publishing world. The release of these principles represented a tipping point in global consensus around post-publication name changes. In the months following its release, many major publishers released new policies, including Wiley, Taylor and Francis Sage, Elsevier, and most recently in the last few weeks, Springer. As of today, almost 2 years exactly since I started working on this, there are 44 publishers and journals who've adopted trans-inclusive name change policies that we're aware of. Returning to the 2 challenges I described at the beginning of my talk, I believe we are at a point where there is now broad support for the first one. The 5 principles from our article, however, don't just speak to the challenge of persuading publishers to change names. They also help clarify the areas where we commonly see the implementation of the policies falling short. To better understand this, I will unpack the 5 principles in some small amount of detail. And I realize we're coming up to the end of the hour. I'm at about 37 minutes of speaking. I probably got another 10 minutes or so to go. I'd like to keep you all here to go through this together. The first principle was accessibility. We wrote, name changes should be available to authors upon request without legal documentation, unnecessary barriers, burdens, or labor placed upon the author making the request. We'd seen that publishers struggled with the extent to which they should require proof of identity from the requesting author. I had to talk ACM down from requiring documentation of a legal name change during our policy discussions. When allowed, legal name change processes are slow, bureaucratic, costly, and inaccessible to many trans people for reasons outside of their control. Requiring legal proof of a name change would set an unreasonable bar that would exclude the most vulnerable members of the community. Eliminating legal gatekeeping also reduces the overall labor involved in implementing a name change for both authors and publishers. Our second principle is comprehensiveness. We wrote, name changes should remove all instances of an author's previous name from the records maintained and disseminated by a publisher. This includes, but is not limited to, metadata, digital documents, works citing authors' works, tables of content, acknowledgements, bios, pronouns, website URLs, etc. And in many ways, this principle is one of the most difficult to implement, due in part to a lack of existing infrastructure for such changes. Names pervade our digital platforms. Every day, I must contend with the digital ghost of my previous identity, and I'll probably be requesting its removal from databases for the rest of my life. And no matter how hard I wish this were possible, I'll never be able to correct my name in the printed versions of my papers and books that are already in circulation. However, accepting these limitations, this principle is aspirational. We argue The publishers should aim to change names wherever they appear in their programs or in their platforms. Our third principle was invisibility. We wrote, name changes should not draw attention to the gender identity of an author, nor create a clear juxtaposition between the current name and the previous name. This principle is intended to protect the privacy of the author and to reduce the number of potential disclosures of an author's dead name. We advocate for foregoing traditional announcements and notices typically associated with updates, corrections, retractions, and errata, both in metadata structures and on changed documents. This is another place where we could benefit from new infrastructures, as current publishing and dissemination systems are not designed to push discrete updates of names to third parties. Our fourth principle is expediency and simplicity. We wrote, name changes should be implemented in a timely manner with a minimum of bureaucratic overhead. If dead names are essentially information viruses, then they need to be quarantined as soon as possible once a publisher has been notified about them. To facilitate this, publishers need to provide a centralized path to changing an author's name to minimize the labor of coming out. This is an area where even the most supportive publishers often fall short due to a lack of staff resources, a lack of clear internal processes, and inflexible digital systems. Some of this can be fixed by instituting better workflows and processes. However, building these principles into our software platforms, database structures, and document standards will greatly reduce labor over the long term. Our fifth and final principle has to do with recurrence and maintenance. We wrote that publishers should regularly audit and correct new instances of changed names in order to prevent ongoing dissemination of incorrect information. The problem of previously indexed versions of papers means that even after a name has been corrected, it's likely that an author will continue to be cited incorrectly. Once a name change has been implemented, publishers should be prepared for some degree of ongoing maintenance of their records to remove recurrences of the previous name. This, more than any other principle we have laid out, has the potential to entail the publisher and/or the requesting author into an unsustainable amount of ongoing labor, at least with our current infrastructures and practices. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to reflect on how the challenges posed by these principles can prompt us to rethink the platforms and infrastructures of identity in academic publishing and beyond. Currently, in a PDF-based publishing ecosystem, updating names on documents requires a person to directly edit the document by hand. The process is time-intensive, often involving multiple back-and-forth conversations between authors and publishers about what needs to be corrected, and then confirmation that the corrections have been carried out properly in multiple iterations. One of my colleagues had to wait 9 months for the ACM to complete updating her 89 publications. If we want to do better, we will need to find ways to exponentially reduce the amount of manual human labor involved in processing and accommodating name changes. This means moving away from publishing platforms built around archaic print-first assumptions and towards platforms that treat the author's name as a dynamic variable that can be automatically updated by individuals rather than institutions. Platforms like ORCID already provide us with a template for how to think about this. In an ORCID profile, the author's name is just another user-editable field that is independent of the numerical ID that serves to identify the author as an entity to the system of data. We need to develop and adopt dynamic platforms that support the ability for an author to update their name on their ORCID profile and see it automatically propagate across all of their published works and across all places where those works are cited or indexed. This doesn't just serve the needs of the authors. It also allows publishers and readers to unambiguously attribute and cross-reference works. Such an approach would allow for more robust bibliometric analysis and tracking, and would also allow for greater discoverability of related scholarship. As more and more publishers adopt inclusive identity policies, the number of name change requests that publishers must accommodate is only going to increase. Up to this point, I've been using the case of transgender name changes to help contextualize why our working group has been advocating for specific aspects of these policies. Thank you so much. I'm dying here. However, my expectation is that as the possibility of name changes becomes more widespread and more commonly known, that eventually trans people will be in the minority of people seeking name changes to previous publications. This is because many of us change our names over the course of our lives due to marriage, divorce, religious conversion, or even just for purely aesthetic personal reasons. Central to the guidance that we have been developing with COPE is the idea that these name changes must be inclusive and available to anyone, regardless of their reason for changing their name. Growing up, my sister often bemoaned the fact that her name was simply Beth and not Elizabeth, but she never changed it because there isn't a cultural norm for changing our first names, and because the systems that track and maintain our identities are not built to accommodate the possibility of our identities being fluid and changeable. And perhaps this made sense in an analog world. Perhaps it made sense when our civic institutions relied primarily upon names to track and regulate their populations. But in a world where names are indexed by computational systems, it is absurd that we still rely upon them as the primary identifier for any given record. Facilitating name changes in our platforms is an equity issue that extends far beyond the need to protect transgender people's privacy. Since beginning this work, I've had many women approach me with stories about having aspects of their lives complicated by their decision to publish under a particular name when they were younger. One friend who first published under her pre-married name chose to retain it when she married. She told me how she was initially viewed with suspicion when picking up her children at school because she didn't share their last name. Another woman shared with me that she had just stopped reporting several of her earliest publications on her CV because they were published under the surname of an abusive ex-husband, and she couldn't bear to see that name anymore. So, while the particular vulnerabilities of trans people are what motivated the creation of these policies, I anticipate them being used to address longstanding inequalities that have disproportionately harmed women. This highlights the ways in which the existing assumptions about identity that have been encoded within our platforms and infrastructures serve to establish and maintain specific, often gendered power structures. The reason we haven't solved this problem already is because our systems are designed to accommodate the needs of a patriarchal neo-feudal capitalist society. In our world, historically, the privilege of having a fixed name throughout one's life has been reserved for land-owning, white, straight, cisgender men. Such men were empowered to mark their property with the brand of their family, their surname. Mary Draz discusses these infrastructures in terms of externalized memory and considers how the rigid encoding of gendered information within our systems of documentation serves to exert control over people who might transgress against the normative social order. Writing about the consequences of a mismatch between one's lived gender and one's identity documents, she writes, "While for many people such documents are barely noticeable, the memory is sufficiently punishing for others. Regardless of how someone is living or how others affirm their lived gender, the past assignment preserved at this level can resist forgetting. The documentation too easily serves as a reminder. This memory in turn is used to either support or contradict the present. For those who are privileged by current arrangements, for whom the memory is more or less correct, these systems of classification do not feel punishing. For those who experience this disconnect between lived and documented gender, the reminder of the document and the persistence of a past assignment preserved therein can certainly burn." The work of correcting the publication records to affirm people's current identities is a form of what Draz would call resistant forgetting. Forgetting is not endorsed here as an abstract good. To the contrary, it is a specific tool wielded against an overdetermined and overdetermining past. Resistant forgetting, therefore, involves thinking differently, not only about how or why we participate in mundane everyday acts of identity documentation, but also about the kinds of punishments with which this memory making is entwined. Creating space for people to update their previous work returns agency and autonomy to individuals over their identities. A necessary next step is to rethink how our systems, platforms, and infrastructures might be improved so that they no longer serve the needs of some abstract normative order, but instead serve the needs of the community of living people whose lives they impact. I'd like to end today's talk by asking each of you to reflect on your own assumptions when creating software systems. Our software systems don't privilege all people's experiences equally. Each design choice about what data to collect, how to categorize it, how to preserve it, and what aspects to treat as immutable or unchangeable is an assertion of power. As a community of people who are invested in the project of building and maintaining platforms that can potentially operate as systems of externalized memory, you have the power to consider whether your designs serve to reproduce existing hierarchies and systems of oppression, or whether they return power and agency to vulnerable people. We have an opportunity to explore the consequences and possibilities of new identity infrastructures within the publishing world, but in the long run, I believe that the same approach needs to be extended to every platform and system that maintains any kind of identity records. I argue that if we're going to have to live with systems and platforms that exert this kind of gravity over our identities, we should build those systems to serve the needs of the most vulnerable of us, because doing so will empower all of us in the long run. Thank you for sticking around a little over time. I look forward to having a conversation with you about this work.
Oh my God, thank you so much for that amazing talk. That was absolutely phenomenal. It was so powerful, and I really appreciate everything you had to say in there.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I kind of like dried out midway through, and my voice was dying in the middle of this. But no, this is work that is very near and dear to me, in case that wasn't very evident. Do we have time for some questions, or are we sort of into the break at this point?
No, I'd love for some Q&A to happen. So everyone who's here, oh, we already have a first question. Wonderful. So we have one question. Are there any papers or articles we should cite to give you and your collaborators credit for this incredible effort?
Yes, and in fact, I'm going to type an answer in here because you'll be able to get to all of that on our website. I can't type. My working group has launched a website in the last month, www.ncpwg.org. And it includes links to everything that we've released, including my Nature article, the white paper that we produced on Medium, and the COPE editorial, as well as some peer-reviewed work that some of my colleagues in the group have produced. And it also has resources for authors seeking to change their names and resources for publishers seeking to adopt these kinds of policies. So we're in the process of sort of rolling out a consultancy around this for publishers, because we did this clever thing where we convinced publishers that they really, really needed a very specific thing that only we are really qualified to provide. And so we've created a demand for services that we're now going to be providing to them, because any equity work needs to be compensated. And we're going to try to make that happen.
Any other questions? We'd love to take maybe 1 to 2 more questions. If you can put it in the Q&A feature, you can put it in the chat. If not, I have one more question that we'd love to ask. I'll give it a few. Okay, I'll probably ask our question. So in your opinion, what should be the best practices for authors to avoid dead naming before submitting papers?
So this is tricky, right? Because none of us are in the habit of double checking the names of every person that we cite to see whether or not they've changed them. So ultimately, I don't want this to be something that other people have to think about or concern themselves with. I want this to be something that our infrastructures handle for us, because it's requiring people to go out and check whether somebody's changed their name inevitably puts them in a situation of learning that that person's changed their name and disclosing private information about them. And I would much rather that so one of the things I want to do is talk to folks like Zotero and Mendeley and EndNote about integrating publishers who have done name changes so that they can just propagate name changes into databases of bibliographic references automatically. Because I really do think that the more we can automate this process, the more invisible we can make it. I do go through the process of checking names of colleagues who I know were questioning or thinking about a name change to see whether or not they've actually changed their name. but I don't think it scales well to ask people if they have 100 citations in a work to check the names of the 300 authors in order to see whether one of them happens to be trans. And so, yeah, that's a tough one. Ultimately, it needs to be something that we fix infrastructurally and institutionally and not at an individual level. Somebody has asked if I could share an invite link to the Discord server. If you send me a message on Twitter, I am at Tess Tanenbaum, and introduce yourself, I will send you the Discord link. I'm not going to sort of broadcast it widely, just to protect the privacy of the folks in the group. But I am at Tanenbaum. I'm putting my Twitter in the answer section. I'm just going to go through these questions if that's okay. What should happen when citing a paper with multiple authors in which the authors with dead names don't appear in the citations? Well, if you have a paper that's got an et al. And like there's enough authors in the author list that they don't show up, then I think you're golden, right? Like unless there is some metadata somewhere that's containing the dead name that you're not aware of, then I think you're okay. I think the goal is to keep the dead name from circulation, right? And so if you've got a medical paper that has 100 authors on it from different labs, then citing it as like first author et al. And then dead name is buried somewhere in the et al. I think that's okay, right? Yeah. Does that answer that question? Okay, I'm going to assume it does. Cool. Answered live. William Agnew has asked, can you talk more about how you started getting organizations to pay for this work? The short answer is we're just now working on that. So we've been having a conversation in the name change group about the ways in which the power dynamics between us and the publishing world have shifted in the 2 years that we've been doing this work. When I started out, like we were just happy to be asked. We were just grateful that someone was listening to us finally. And that's how a lot of equity work is often done, where publishers and institutions and organizations take advantage of the fact that oppressed and marginalized people are so desperate to be treated with basic equity and basic human decency that we are willing to donate a bunch of our time and effort if that gets us closer to being treated with dignity and equity. And thankfully, what has happened is that because we've managed to change this consensus around name changes, we're now at a point where the tables have now turned. There's now, we are now fielding requests from publishers weekly asking for us to read and provide feedback on their articles or on their policies. And so we have been thinking about like what is an appropriate rate that we charge, which publishers do we volunteer our time for? So if it's a small press or a not-for-profit, or it's a group that's expressly in an equity space, we don't want to charge them for our labor. We want to donate that labor. But if it's someone like Elsevier or Sage or Springer, where they're a big commercial publisher that's already profiting off the back of academics and exploiting academics, then we're very much going to sort of take a pardon my French, a fuck you, pay me approach to the work. Because we've provided the resources where if they choose not to pay us, we're confident that they can probably get it right if they take the time to read what we've written. But most of the time, what people are doing is they're asking me to sit in a room with them and tell them what I've already written down, because they're not willing to read it for themselves and internalize it. They need to like actually ask me questions about it that I've already answered. And so in that case, like we very much need to be taking their money just on a matter of principle. If we discover that one of our own previous papers uses someone's dead name, how do you suggest we go about fixing it so that all that labor does not fall on the person who changed their name? That's such a great question, Raj. I have here, I'm going to actually pull up a link to a web page that I posted back in the day. It's called How to Talk About Tess. And it does two things. Where did our Q&A disappear to? This is a site that I maintain that I last updated last year, but it has remained pretty accurate, where I sort of said, look, people are going to know that I'm trans. Why is that not actually posting here? I'm not in a position where I'm hiding the fact that I'm trans, and so because I'm being very open about the fact that I'm trans, here's some help for how to cite me, where I've actually sort of provided some heuristics for people, and at the bottom of that is a section on how other ways you can help, and it has something that for a long time was in my email signature. It was a necronym check. There was a bullet point list of ways that you can help prevent the propagation of a dead name if you happen to be a carrier of it. And some of that is to just audit your records and sort of look for instances of it and correct it and change it in your own documents, correct your own PDFs before disseminating them. The other is to look whether or not the publisher of the PDF has a name change policy. If they do, you can reach out to the publisher through the email that is provided attached to that policy and say, there is a name in this document that I know is incorrect. I would like it to be fixed. Chances are very good that publishers are not going to make that change. And the reason why is because one of the places where we have permitted gatekeeping and deference to a desire to protect everybody involved has been the idea that we really do, like, publishers really want name change requests to be made by the author who's affected by them and not by a third party. Just because when you introduce the possibility of a third party interfering with somebody else's work, it can get ethically challenging and complicated very quickly. But if it is the case that, like me, I have said to the ACM, I want my name changed in the bibliographies of every paper that cites me. And they have on record that I've requested that. But I'm not willing to reach out to everybody who cites me personally, because that's madness. That's humiliating. And the ACM currently is not willing to do that labor. Then having the authors of papers that cite me come forward and say, oh, I happen to miscite Tess in this previous paper. Can you correct it in my work? At that point, your request links up with my request, and they're able to execute it in theory. This is untested. Like, citations remain, again, something that I very much believe should be the responsibility of publishers and ultimately needs to move off of the plate of people doing manual corrections and into the domain of automatic dynamic propagation of information, because the labor of it just becomes unsustainable very quickly.
Okay, awesome. Thank you again so much, in particular for sharing your experiences and making yourself so vulnerable, talking about the harms against people who are dead named in publications, and also just doing so much activism and combating all that bureaucracy and power structures and everything to communicate the work you're doing to, like, enact inclusive name change policies for anyone who wants it. It really should be a right, like you said, for everyone to have access to easy name change policies. And hopefully we can create technology that is not othering and marginalized people and not oppressive marginalized people, and can build a better future together.
I mean, having folks in the machine learning community looking at effective ways of techniques for pronoun disambiguation in body text is going to be huge, right? Because one of the things that we didn't talk about was the need to correct pronouns in addition to names. And with names, they're sufficiently unique that doing a find and replace can often catch it, but like, you have to understand the context clues around a pronoun to know whether or not it should be changed and how it should be changed. And that's the kind of problem that very much fits nicely into an AI machine learning kind of place. So challenge for this community. Go forth, make this happen.